Awesome. Okay, so what I was saying is that whatever I cover today, I will make sure that will be on the quiz, and the vast majority of quiz questions comes from chapter 11. There's only like 4 questions from chapter 12, if that. Okay? All right, so the first thing I'm going to talk about is Nat Turner's Rebellion. Okay? It happened in 1831, and it took place in Southampton County in Virginia. So make sure to just put VA or Virginia. Okay? Now, what's kind of interesting is that a lot of slave owners would justify, slavery because, slavery's in the Bible kind of thing. Talk about your masters and being submissive to your masters. So a lot of slave owners were like, look, like, here it is. Even the Bible supports slavery. Well, here's an example of Nat Turner. He was a slave who learned how to read and write, and he read the Bible, and how he interpreted the Bible was that slavery was wrong. Okay, so this is like an example of how, different interpretation, and so it's going to really, this is like an example of Christianity was a reason to, be against slavery. Okay, and he had there's a mixture of a lunar eclipse and a solar eclipse, and he had a vision from God that he was to spill the first blood that would represent ending slavery. And how he did that, it's basically kill the white man and anyone that represents the institution of slavery, but not slaves. Okay, and so on August 22nd, he and 6 other slaves, so 7 total, okay, decided there was a lunar eclipse that day too. So his vision was a solar eclipse, but the lunar eclipse was when he was like, okay, there's the vision. We need to do this tonight. And so in the middle of the night, he and 6 other slaves will go into their master, who is Mr. Joseph Travis's home. Mr. Travis and his wife were asleep, and basically they used a hatchet, chop them up. Okay? And then they decided to go to the next plantation, do the same thing, and more slaves would join. And eventually 60 slaves would join Nat Turner. Okay, and there's lots of details where, there's Mr. Travis who was, killed and stuff, and then they realized, a mile down the road that there were children, and so they sent Hark, the slave Hark, what's his name, had to go back and finish that job. Just very, very just like point blank. Okay, and what's going to happen is by the early next morning, the Virginia State Militia is there, and they will capture the 60 slaves, and they also will kill black men who are around thinking, oh, why didn't you try to stop them kind of thing. And Nat Turner will escape, and Nat Turner will actually live a nocturnal lifestyle in the woods for 2 months. Okay, so he digs a hole. He hides there during the day. Then at night, he goes and forages for nuts and berries and stuff like that. Okay. In October of 1831, he is scavenging for berries and nuts and stuff. And there's a dog nearby, smells him, starts barking, and that alerts the Virginia militia. Okay. And he is captured, and he will be sentenced to hang. Okay. And while he is waiting, I guess you could say death row, there is a newspaper editor who will go and interview him, okay? And so the reasons, I told you about the baby and the wife and how they use the hatchet and stuff and the lunar eclipse, I know those details because that interview will be published, and it's called The Confessions of Nat Turner. That document really, it was put in lots of newspapers. It's a very short read. I had to read it in college. But, he's very look, he even said, Mr. Joseph Travis, he was a kind master. He goes, in fact, I have no complaints about his treatment of me. But he represented slavery, and he had to die. If you're a slave owner and you read that, and you're regardless, if you think you're treating your slaves, they could still kill you. Okay, and so because of this notorious slave rebellion, 60 white people will be killed in a matter of a few hours. Okay, and this will really lead to a huge increase in what we call those slave codes. Okay, because people do not want a round two of Nat Turner's rebellion. Okay, and again, the impact: stricter slave codes. Okay, I'm just checking. Confessions of Nat Turner. All right, so now, and you can see here just from looking at this slave resistance, y'all know that, you know, rebellions, like slave rebellions, were not that frequent. The most common would be your day-to-day resistance, okay? So you could fake sick not to, you know, work. You could basically just choose not to work as fast. That's still a way to rebel, okay? Stealing things, breaking tools, okay? So like if you break a cotton gin, you're like sticking it to the man, you know what I'm saying? Like, because not as much cotton can be processed now. It's your way of quietly rebelling, okay? No, you don't have to yet. What is, I'm going back and forth between the meat. It's like, yeah, you're good. You know, just that kind of stuff. And then, you know, some would escape. Okay, that's another way. But the most common form of rebelling will be like you're faking your sickness, working slow, breaking tools. We're talking, and the word is covert. Okay, covert, C-O-V-E-R-T. Covert means covered up, meaning not out in the open. So no one knows that you're faking sick, that you broke a tool, okay? Overt slave rebellion would be like Nat Turner's rebellion, Prosser's rebellion, that kind of stuff. Okay? Let's see. All right. Okay, and if you go to the next slide, there is a famous image of Nat Turner when he is captured. Is it not? Go point that way. See. Hold on. Okay. All right, now let's see this. Okay, there we go. So that's a famous image depicting Nat Turner's capture. Okay, remember, Nat Turner's rebellion is probably, of all the rebellions like leading up to the Civil War, this one led to way more severe slave codes. Okay, and there also is a slave revolt on a Spanish ship. Okay, the Amistad, and we'll talk about this a little bit tomorrow. But it's basically, you know, the slaves went against the captain. Okay, and that's going to receive a lot of international news as well, but that's not too important for what we're going for. Okay, so let's see next. Okay, so look at this regional specialization. Okay, want to point out, remember I told you how tobacco was really the first major cash crop in the South, but then eventually we know that tobacco ruins the soil. Okay, and people will move what we call the lower South, and they will focus more on cotton and less on tobacco. Tobacco's gonna be like upper South, okay? But if you look here, you can see that like cotton, what's in green, definitely is like your cotton area. The king cotton is what they called it, okay? So in 1790, okay, tobacco will lose its like economic, they just grew too much, or the soil was messed up. So then some people will switch to growing certain things and they'll move other places. In 1850, British New England textile mills created a huge demand for cotton. So because of this textile industry, the Lowell mills, all that kind of stuff, that created a huge demand for cotton. So think about it. When people are like, what should we grow if tobacco's not really working anymore? They were like, oh, up north, there's all these textile mills. Why don't we grow cotton? So you see, the North did play a role in slavery. It just is a little different than what you probably thought. Okay, and so the lower South is very suited for the cultivation of cotton. The main reason, that warm climate. It's great to grow cotton. Okay, And what it is at first, people were like, oh, why don't we grow sugar? The thing is for sugar, in order to make a profit, you have to grow a lot of it. It's a huge investment. And so in order for you to be successful with sugar, you have to really risk a lot and, you know, do a lot, have a lot of land, a lot of crops, okay? But then people discovered if you grow cotton, you can make money even with a little amount of extra cotton. Okay, so that's why people were another reason for why cotton. Okay, do want to point out in 1850s, 35 to 50% of all farmers in the Cotton Belt, okay, so in that green area, owned no slaves. Okay, now of the slaves that are there, 75% of those slaves, they had their task and stuff were related to cotton. Okay. What's also interesting is corn. Okay. So how it works is when cotton is not in season, you can actually grow corn in the same spot. Okay. So that's another reason for cotton. Okay. The fact that you can grow like one season, you know, cotton, and then the next season you have corn going up. So it's like a constant rotation. And you only had to really do the work, you know, once. And so that's another reason. People said, why do sugar with this huge investment if on the same piece of land you can do corn and cotton at the same time? Okay. Okay, so in 1860, the 12 wealthiest counties in all of America were all in the South. We're all in the South. Okay, so if you look at the chart, it says the South King Cotton. Okay, if you look at this, okay, you can see that in 1800, so that's the election, that revolution of 1800, when Jefferson wins, okay, 7% of all exports was cotton. Okay, but by 1860, that's the election of Lincoln, a year before the Civil War starts, 57% of all exports. Okay, so what I would suggest is draw two, in this little box right here, okay, draw two circles. We're going to, is it called a pie chart? I know it's been a while for me. I want you to have, you see it says like 7% right there. Have one circle that represents 7% being cotton in 1800. And then just draw this one right here, which is showing you 57% in 1860. Don't worry about drawing four circles. Just do the 1800 one and the 1860 one. And again, you can just say 57% and 7%. That's fine. Okay, so now this one, this is about Southern population 1860. These are all little pie charts that tell you what the percentage is. The greenish represents white people in the South. Okay, so if you look, I did like some green circles. There's only two, I think, okay, where slaves make up the majority. Okay, in Mississippi, 55% of the population were slaves. And then in South Carolina, 57% were slaves. Now, if you look, though, a lot of places, it's almost even. We're talking like 55, 45. That's how it is in Florida, Georgia, Alabama. I mean, it's very close. But you can also tell, too, that like Delaware and Maryland and Kentucky, they also have, they're technically not considered the South, but they will have slaves, too. Okay, so just note that it's almost 50-50, okay, but there are two states, okay. And if you look at this is just showing you, in case you're not a visual person, South Carolina had the most slaves in terms of population, okay. Okay, so now The next thing is talking about the upper South and the lower South. So please make sure you know the difference. So we're filling this out in this chart right here. Okay. Okay, thank y'all. Like I said, it's kind of hard for me because I can't see the meat, and it's a weird thing what I'm doing, so I'm having to go back and forth. Okay, so thank y'all. So make sure you know what is in the upper South and what is in the lower South. Okay, and you'll see, even though these make up the South, it's kind of like, okay, remember how we talked about the Chesapeake colonies back in the day, and inside the Southern colonies, you have the Chesapeake colonies? Okay, well, inside of the South in the 1800s, you have what's called the upper South will have more in common, and then you have the lower South, which has more in common, okay? So, for instance, the characteristics in the upper South, they're more urban areas, okay? Or like Richmond, Virginia, remember like Tredegar Iron Works. They're much more urban areas, okay? And we know that the upper South isn't really going to focus on cotton. What will they focus on? Tobacco. Okay. Now for the lower South, clearly a lot more of those rural areas. When you think of plantations, there were much more of those in the lower South than the upper South. And y'all know what was the major cash crop in the lower South? Cotton and corn, but mainly cotton. Okay, and if you notice, I put in yellow Alabama and Mississippi in yellow. That's actually another area that's even more distinct. They're referred to as the Deep South, okay, because like the amount of cotton from those areas was way more than others in the lower South. So we're talking like, you know, the upper South, think tobacco, more, you know, up north, and then like more urban. The lower South, definitely focusing more on cotton, more rural. And then inside of that, you have the Deep South, which is even more rural, even more cotton. Okay? So you can see, here's a little chart here, the slave population based off of the census. Okay? So you can see that, especially like near coastal areas, there's going to be a lot more slaves. Okay? But look down south, there's a lot. Okay? Next thing, okay, north and south diverge. Just want to point out, we know the South, they had a lack of industry. You need to know the percentage. They had 10% of the nation's industry. So one example would be your Tredegar Iron Works, okay? But 10% of the nation's industry, that is important, okay? And again, Tredegar Iron Works was the number 4 in terms of producing iron. Okay, so I mean, that's important, but that was like the main, most successful industry in the South during antebellum America. Okay, also want to point out that the factories that did exist in the South were much more primitive than what you had up north. Okay, so for instance, in the South, okay, Southern factories would turn grain into flour. So basically, you take the grains and you almost like mortar and pestle it down into flour. Okay, that's just like one step. Okay. And then they would take corn and then like you grind it up into a corn mill, okay? And then logs into lumber, okay? Are they actually turning logs into like ships? No, that would be up north. You see, it's industry, but it's just like one little step more of industry. The South had a small amount of industry, and the industry they had was just like very primitive, like a one-step industry. Okay. Yeah, cornmeal. Good. Open land. Where is that, Alex? Open land. Okay, it's 10% for nations manufacturing. I'll explain the 25% in a second, but it's 10%. The extra land, yeah, tobacco. If there was land for growing, it'd be tobacco, but then there were more cities up north too. Okay, so now let's turn to the backside. Okay, and this is where we get that 25%. Okay, all right. So we're talking about this old South. Okay, this little circle right here. I want you to turn this into a little pie chart, okay? To me, we know that 10% is an important, the manufacturing thing for the South, but if there is one percentage that is like super, 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 super important, it's this percentage right here. That in the South, 25% of white people actually own slaves. That's what you need to know, okay? So the fact that, people are like, oh, all white people, no, 25%. And of that, you will see it's like a minority within a minority, okay? Just remember that 25% in 1860 of all white Southerners actually owned slaves. Okay? So now let's talk about the social groups of the white South. Okay, so in 1860, 25% of all white families owned slaves. Okay? All right. And then of that 25%, okay, half owned fewer than 5 slaves. So you see, of the 25%, half of them actually owned less than 5 slaves. Okay, so what that's telling you is there's a very small percentage that owned lots of slaves. Okay, only 12% owned 20 or more slaves. Okay, and only 1% owned 100 or more slaves. Slaves are very expensive. A slave cost about $2,000 back then. Okay, so you can see, like, you had to be really rich to own lots of slaves. Okay, so now let's talk about the white Southerners. Okay, so the first thing is what you call the planters. Okay, the planters. Okay, and this meant, like, the basic definition is you had to own at least 20 slaves. If you're a white male and you owned at least 20 slaves, you are a planter. Okay, and they will live in, like, the low counties, like the lower South, basically. The lower South, and like Delta regions, because in the Delta there's lots of water, very warm climate, lots of cotton. Okay, so we need lots of slaves, basically. After 1820, that's when you start to see these planters with those antebellum plantation mansions. Okay, and their wealth was based off of, like, how many slaves they had and stuff. So they may not have all these, like, chandeliers and stuff, because again, their wealth was really based off of how many slaves you had. Okay, and so if they needed to, like, purchase something luxurious, they usually would have to sell a slave, and they probably wouldn't want to do that. Okay, next we have the small slaveholders. Okay, that is going to be 88% of all slaveholders owned fewer than 20 slaves. So if you own 20 slaves at least, you are a planter. If you owned 19 or less, you're called a small slaveholder. Okay, these tend to be younger white males, because, maybe if you're younger, you don't have as much money. So maybe you want to have 20 slaves and be a planter and be in that little class, but you're not there yet. You're a small slaveholder. Okay, next you have, so those two means, like, you own slaves. The next two groups, definitely, they're white males who did not own slaves. And again, these people would be 75% of those white Southerners. Okay, so you have a group called the Yeomen or Yeomen. Okay, and this is the largest group of, Southern white males. Okay, most were landowners. I know that's a small blank. Most did own land. Okay, and when it came to, like, harvest time, okay, they will rent slaves or hire slaves. Okay, they don't own slaves, but when needed, they would, like, have an agreement. Maybe a planter would loan out a slave, and, like, the yeoman would rent that slave temporarily. Okay, and most of the yeomen or yeomans were subsistence farmers. So again, they're not really growing cash crops. They're growing just enough just to survive. All right. And the idea is self-sufficiency with modest profit. They grew not really to sell. They grew to eat, and if there was extra, they would sell. Okay? And like the Delta area where like the big mansions are and stuff, a lot of people view these white males as poor white trash, which is kind of interesting. Okay? People of the Pine Barrens, it's the bottom, okay? And it's 10% of white Southerners. Okay, and they usually were squatters. Okay, if you're a squatter, that means you are living somewhere that you do not have the rights to live. Okay, for instance, like my parents, one thing they do is they like to like flip houses and stuff, and like they bought a house and they went to like meet with a contractor to try to flip it and stuff, and they heard some commotion in the house they just bought, and apparently someone was living in this like big walk-in closet and like heard someone, and they like ran through the back. That person was a squatter. Okay, so people of the Pine Barrens usually were squatters. Okay, and most refused to be hired out. Okay, for labor, because think about it. So again, these are just people who are just living off people's land. Okay, but they're not going to be hired out because they do not want people to compare them with slaves. Because I think the Yeomen are hiring slaves. They're saying, no, we do not get hired out. Okay, and this was mainly a lifestyle by choice. So what I want you to do y'all see this little like triangle? Okay, I want you to basically fill in that triangle. Planters at the top, and it's a very small, okay? Then small slaveholders, Yeomen, and then the Pine Barren people, that 10%. So just make sure you know that order. And then like your lawyers and physicians, they weren't, they basically like were their own little thing. They didn't make up the majority. There's such a minority of them. They don't put on this little like pyramid thing. Okay. Also, just want to point out plantation wives. They really ran a lot because again, a lot of the plantation owners, the slave owners, they are actually gone a lot because they're going to all the different slave auctions in the South. Okay, so who's really running the plantation? Usually it was the plantation wife. Okay, also something else, there was a lot of mulatto children, where the infidelity on the slave owner's part, he basically viewed these women, these African slave women, as his property and treated them like that. And so it was very common to have like mixed children around, but you just never talked about it. You never like said, hey, it is what it is. It happened, but you don't acknowledge it. You just try to just pretend that doesn't happen. Okay. And a lot of the people in the state legislatures making state laws were planters. So that's why a lot of state laws passed really strict slave codes. Okay. So now we're going to talk about the conflict over slavery. There are two books you need to know, and I would write them down: Uncle Tom's Cabin and The Impending Crisis of the South. Okay, we know about Uncle Tom's Cabin. That's Harriet Beecher Stowe. She exposed how slavery was wrong. The idea of like the whipping, the rape, the the auction block, all that. Okay, The Impending Crisis of the South is a little different. Okay, because we know, slavery is morally wrong. Well, here's a difference. This is someone saying slavery is wrong, but it's not really what you think. Okay, so Hinton R. Helper was a white male from North Carolina, and he wrote a book, and it's more like it's not a novel. It is like an argument, a scholarly argument called The Impending Crisis of the South. Okay, and he basically said that slavery is bad economically, because the people who suffer the most from slavery are the poor white men. Because again, they're not going to work. They're not going to be hired out, because why hire someone when you can own someone, basically? And so as slavery helps the planter class of whites, slavery also hurts the poor whites the most in slavery. That's his argument. Okay, and it has statistics. Okay, did he believe, like, he still, you could say, was a white supremacist. Okay, he was not, I mean, he definitely was racist, but you see, he's not saying slavery is morally wrong like Harriet Beecher Stowe. He is saying that slavery is economically wrong. Because of slavery, the South has very little industry, very little cities, very bad literacy rates. During the Civil War, 60% of the soldiers in the South were illiterate. Okay, he's saying here are all these reasons why slavery is bad economically. Okay, and then saying, and then who really is the huge victim of slavery? The poor white people, because they will never really get that chance to rise in society because of slavery. That is his argument. Okay, it was published in 1857, so this is really close to the Civil War. Okay, and there was a huge debate about it in Congress, and I mean, of course, both these books were banned in the South and praised in the North. Hinton R. Helper. Hinton Helper. And it was so bad that after he published it, the South, really just hated it. He left North Carolina and moved to New York because he just knew, like, he basically was viewed as like a traitor in the South. Okay. All right. We are going to skip the pro-slavery argument. We'll get to that tomorrow. Okay. So let's talk about slave life. Just note, even though in 1808 there's no more international slave trade, there's now the internal slave trade. So it's like slaves are going to be traded. Think the auction block. There's no middle passage anymore, but there's still, trading going on. Okay. Men who were about 25 years old were kind of valued the most. Usually they're strong, they're at their peak. Young women are also valued because they have energy. They also can reproduce and have more slaves. Okay. Y'all know there's a lot of different types of labor. You'll have your house servants. Okay. You'll have the slave driver, which is basically a supervisor. That is a slave. Okay. You have your craftsmen who would be making things for the plantation. And then you had your field hands. Okay. And there were slave quarters. Okay. And also there's punishment for different things. So if you didn't produce enough cotton when you went to the cotton gin building to get it weighed, you could be whipped. Okay. And there's Solomon Northrop, who basically, his little thing right there talked about that. He was actually a free man living in the North, was a tailor. And because of the Fugitive Slave Act.
Good morning, men and high. It's time for the pledge, followed by a moment of silence. Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
I'm going to stop here because I know for a fact I have covered everything that would be on your quiz. I do have a quizzes. I will post. It is optional. Okay. I'll post it. Just note it covers all of chapter 12. So if you're like, oh, I didn't get that, we probably haven't covered it. If we covered it, it could be on the quiz. But y'all can go ahead and log off.
Please note that there's a Google Classroom that you can join every afternoon, Monday through Thursday. The information is in the announcement. There's a Google Classroom code that's there, and you can get some help